I have rejected 47 ships. That number follows me everywhere I go. It sits in my personnel file like a bruise that never heals. It comes up in conversations that people think I cannot hear, spoken in the careful, clipped tones that my kind use when they are trying to be polite about something they find deeply embarrassing. 47 ships, 47 perfectly functional, structurally sound, technically impressive vessels, each one certified by no fewer than 3 independent inspection bodies, and I walked off every single one of them within the first hour of boarding. My name is Sael Vrix. I am a Zitharan diplomat and a certified resonance empath, which means I was born with the ability to feel the emotional history of spaces. Not people, spaces. Rooms, corridors, structures. Every place that has been inhabited long enough carries something of the lives lived inside it. Most empaths use this ability to assess buildings, colony sites, medical facilities. I was assigned to ships because the Conclave believed it would be useful to have someone who could evaluate a vessel not just by its engineering specs, but by something harder to measure, its capacity to sustain life in the fullest sense of the word. What they did not anticipate was that I would find almost nothing worth sustaining. Every ship I had ever boarded felt the same: cold, hollow, precise. The Mekthar cruisers hummed with mechanical efficiency, and nothing else. The Valori pleasure vessels were worse. They had been designed to feel luxurious, which meant someone had tried to manufacture warmth, and produced something that felt like a painting of a fire. Beautiful to look at, completely without heat. The Doran trade ships were functional to the point of aggression, as though comfort had been considered and then personally offended the engineers responsible. I wrote my reports. I submitted my rejections. I explained, carefully and repeatedly, that a ship which feels emotionally inert will cause long-term psychological strain in any crew that spends significant time aboard it, and that this should matter to an organization called the Conclave of Interstellar Welfare. The Conclave agreed with me in principle. In practice, they began routing my assignments through Elder Vaunt Rix, who had the patient, slightly pained expression of a man managing a problem he had inherited from someone else. The humans have applied again, he told me, 3 months ago, in the particular tone one uses when delivering news that is technically good, but personally inconvenient. Third application. The trade route they are offering is genuinely significant. We need a recommendation. Send me the engineering reports and I am sending you. He folded his hands on the desk. You will board their vessel, the ISV Endurance, and you will travel with them for the standard assessment period. You will submit a full report. And Sael. He paused in the way that people pause when they are about to say something they have rehearsed. If you reject this one, I need the documentation to be thorough enough that even I cannot argue with it, because the council is beginning to ask questions about your methodology that I am running out of answers for. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I respected it, even as I understood exactly what it meant. This was my last assignment. Approve the ship or come home permanently. I packed my things, and I tried not to think about the fact that I was almost certainly going to walk off the Endurance within the first hour, just like all the others. I was wrong about the first hour. I did not even make it past the airlock. The moment the boarding seal released and the door opened, something hit me. And I mean that in the most literal, physical sense I am capable of describing. It was not a sound. It was not a temperature. It was the feeling of walking into a place where an enormous amount of living had happened, all at once, from every direction. It stopped me where I stood. My crystalline nervous system, which processes emotional resonance the way human eyes process light, simply lit up, all of it. At the same time, I stood in the airlock of a 40-year-old deep hauler, and I felt, for the first time in my professional career, that I had walked into somewhere that was genuinely and unmistakably alive. Captain Mara Osi found me standing there approximately 90 seconds later. She was a compact woman, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that has spent a long time outdoors and in difficult weather, and made peace with it. She looked at me the way people look at guests who have arrived, and immediately done something slightly unusual. Not alarmed, just curious. "Ambassador Vrix," she said, "you okay?" "I am," I said. "I apologize. I needed a moment." She nodded, as though this were a perfectly normal thing to need at an airlock, and she showed me to my quarters, and then offered to give me a tour. I accepted. I had never wanted a tour of a ship before in my life. I had always treated them as formalities to be endured before I began the serious work of documenting what was missing. This tour was different from the first step. The Endurance was not a beautiful ship. I want to be clear about that, because beauty is the first thing most people reach for when they try to explain why a place feels special, and it was not the right word here. The Endurance was old, and it showed every year of its age without apology. The hull plating in the lower corridors was a patchwork of 3 different manufacturers' materials, each a slightly different shade of gray, like a quilt made from practical decisions rather than aesthetic ones. The lighting in the cargo section was warmer than the lighting in the crew quarters, because, Captain Osei explained, someone had replaced the original panels after a power surge 12 years ago, and ordered the wrong color temperature, and then everyone had decided they preferred it. The ship had been modified so many times for so many different purposes that it had stopped resembling its original design in the way that a person stops resembling their childhood photographs. Recognizably the same, but shaped by everything that had happened in between. There was a small kitchen that smelled of spices I could not identify. There was a greenhouse in what had once been secondary cargo storage, tended by a crew member named Petros, who had an extensive and passionate relationship with tomatoes. There were photographs fixed to the walls of the main corridor, not decorative prints, but actual personal photographs, the kind that contain specific people at specific moments, slightly blurred or poorly lit, kept not because they are perfect, but because they are true. There was a mural on the wall of the recreation area, painted directly onto the metal, depicting a coastline that I later learned was on a planet called Earth, in a country called Portugal, where the chief navigator had grown up and had not visited in 11 years. And there, beside the entrance to the engine room, set into the wall like a small window into something permanent, was an engraved metal plate. I stopped when I saw it. "Is that a memorial?" I asked. Captain Osei's expression shifted into something quieter. "Chief Engineer Tomas Ribeiro," she said. "He served on the Endurance for 22 years. When he knew he was dying, he asked if he could stay with the ship. We had his ashes placed in the hull cavity behind that plate." She paused. "No regulatory body approved it. We did it anyway. I looked at the plate for a long time. In 30 years of ship assessments, I had never encountered a vessel that contained its dead. I did not have a category for it in my report template. I was not sure whether to be disturbed or moved. I settled, eventually, on moved, because that was the honest answer. Over the following days, I watched the crew of the Endurance the way I had never allowed myself to watch any crew before. Not as subjects of an assessment, but simply as people. I watched the junior navigator, a young woman named Cho, argue loudly and cheerfully with the cook about whether a particular dish counted as breakfast. I watched 2 engineers conduct an entire technical discussion using only hand gestures because they were passing through an area where a 3rd crew member was sleeping and neither of them wanted to wake her. I watched Captain Osei, at the end of a very long day dealing with a minor navigation error and a malfunctioning coolant relay, sit down at the small table in the kitchen, accept a cup of something hot from Petros, and simply breathe for 10 minutes without speaking to anyone. The ship absorbed all of it. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Every moment of friction and warmth and boredom and patience and occasional shouted frustration. The Endurance held all of it, the way very old wood holds the smell of every fire that has ever burned near it. It was not a metaphor I had been trained to use in an official report. It was the most accurate description I had. On the 4th night, I could not sleep. I walked the corridors alone, at what the ship's clock called 3 in the morning, and the Endurance at 3 in the morning was a different kind of alive than it was during the day. Quieter, slower, breathing in the long rhythm of its own systems. I passed the photograph corridor. I passed the mural. I stopped at the engine room plate, and I stood there in the dark, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only comes when no one is watching and there is nothing to perform, what I had been doing wrong for 30 years. I had been walking onto ships and waiting to feel something. I had been measuring them against a standard I had never written down and finding them insufficient, and every time I walked off another vessel and submitted another rejection, I had told myself that I was doing my job correctly, that I had high standards, that I was protecting future crews from environments that would quietly diminish them. But standing in that corridor, in the dark, next to a dead engineer who had loved his ship enough to ask to stay inside it forever, I understood that the other ships had not been empty. I had been. I had been so practiced at evaluation, so fluent in the language of what was missing, that I had forgotten how to simply be inside a place without judging it. The Endurance had not passed my test. It had walked around my test entirely, because the humans who lived on it had never thought to ask whether their home was worth feeling things about. They simply felt things about it, continuously, messily, without documentation, for 40 years. And it had become, through nothing more complicated than that sustained and stubborn humanness, the most resonant vessel I had ever encountered in my career. 3 days before we were due to return to conclave space, Elder Von Rix contacted me for a preliminary recommendation. I looked at his face on the communication screen, patient, slightly pained, the expression of a man who has arranged everything very carefully and simply needs me to not disturb the arrangement, and I told him I would submit my full report upon return. He began to explain why a preliminary recommendation would be, I closed the channel. The ship's lighting, which ran on an automated comfort cycle that Captain Osei had never bothered to override, warmed slightly in the corridor outside my quarters. I am not certain it was a coincidence. I am not certain it was not. My report, when I finally submitted it, was 3 times the standard length. It documented, in the formal clinical language of Zythran resonance assessment, the emotional archaeology of a human starship. It described what 40 years of continuous habitation does to a vessel, how grief and celebration and boredom and commitment layer into the structure of a place, the way sediment layers into stone, slowly, without intention, creating something that cannot be manufactured or installed or purchased at any price. It noted that the ISV Endurance contained more genuine emotional resonance per square meter than any vessel in the Conclave's recorded assessment history. It recommended not just approval for Conclave membership, but a formal study that junior empaths should be assigned to human vessels as part of their training to understand what resonance actually means when it occurs naturally rather than by design. I expected to be called in for a review. I expected Von Rix to sit across from me with that particular expression and explain, gently, that my report was unconventional. Instead, the Conclave approved the Endurance. Von Rix sent me a single-line message informing me that my report had been added to the required reading list for the Resonance Assessment Program. He did not explain how he felt about this. He did not need to. Captain Osei calmed me 2 weeks later. She thanked me, briefly and without ceremony, because she was that kind of person. Then there was a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that belongs to people who have shared corridors at 3 in the morning, and she told me the crew had voted. There was a bunk aboard the Endurance, not a formal posting, not an assessment assignment, just a bunk, and a standing invitation, and a spot at the kitchen table if I wanted it. I looked at my office, at the clean desk and the empty walls, and the 47 rejection files stacked in the cabinet by the window, at all that careful, documented quiet. I told her I would need to think about it. Then I started packing. I have always been a terrible liar, and for the first time in 30 years, I was grateful for it.